Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe and explore. You think reality is stable, that the ground beneath your feet is real, that the walls around you are fixed, that the stars overhead burn exactly as they should. You trust that what you see, what you hear, what you touch is constant, unshakable. But I was there when it all came undone. I remember the exact moment it happened. Not a crack, not a tremor, something worse. A shift, so slight at first, like the barely perceptible pause between heartbeat. A silence where there should have been sound. A hesitation in the way the air moved, like existence itself had second-guessed its own structure. It was in that moment I understood something no human mind was ever meant to grasp. Reality is not held together by laws or forces. It is held together by something far more fragile. Observation. The act of looking. The certainty of knowing. The belief, however false, that the world exists beyond the limits of our perception. That it continues when we close our eyes. That the things we leave behind remain exactly as we left them. A lie. It wasn't obvious at first. A missing word in a sentence I was sure had been spoken. A book on the table that hadn't been there a moment before. The faintest feeling that a door had once led to a hallway but now opened to a room that shouldn't exist. Small things. Forgettable things. Things the mind dismisses as nothing. Until they weren't. Until the cracks widened. Until I stood in a place I recognized but no longer trusted. Until I spoke to people who were real one moment and something else the next. The realization came slowly, like a weight settling on my chest, like a breath held too long. I was no longer a man inside a world. I was the only thing holding it together, the only thing left that made it real. And I was losing control. Tell me, have you ever doubted your own memory? Stared at a clock and felt, deep in your bones, that the second hand should have moved when it didn't? Have you ever walked into a room and felt the shape of it was wrong, not unfamiliar, just incorrect? Have you ever sensed something watching from the corner of your eye, something that vanishes the moment you turn? Those are the edges. The thin, trembling borders of a reality that only exists because you believe in it. I stopped believing, and it collapsed. What happens when one person becomes the only observer? You don't want to know. There are those who ask questions for the sake of knowing. The curious. The seekers of knowledge who chip away at the unknown, careful not to disturb whatever sleeps beneath. And then there are those who do not ask. They demand. They do not seek understanding. They seek proof. They do not wish to discover. They wish to shatter. He was one of them. A man who could not look at the world without doubting it. A mind so precise, so relentless, that certainty was not enough. He needed evidence. He needed to reach his hands into the mechanics of existence itself and pull it apart until he saw what lay underneath. Some called him brilliant. Others called him dangerous. Neither word was wrong. In another life, he might have been the kind of scientist who cured diseases, who pushed humanity forward with cautious steps and careful calculations. But that wasn't what he wanted. He didn't care for progress. He didn't care for the future. He cared about the lie, because that's what he believed reality was. A construct. A carefully arranged illusion that people wandered through without question. A thing that did not exist until it was seen. A world that was nothing more than an agreement, an assumption held together by observation alone. But assumptions could be broken. Agreements could be rewritten. He had spent his life pulling at the edges, trying to unravel it, trying to catch the moment when reality hesitated, when it had to decide what it was. But every time he thought he had found proof, it slipped through his fingers. So he built something that wouldn't let it escape. A machine that did not trust its own senses. That did not question itself. That did not blink. A machine that could watch itself. Not a camera, not a lens, not something that merely recorded, but something that perceived. Something that collapsed possibility into certainty without human interference. An observer without bias. A consciousness without memory. And if it could observe itself, Would it become its own reality? Would it replace this one? That was the question he was willing to gamble everything on. Because if he was right, if this world was nothing but a consequence of being watched, then whoever held the power to observe would hold the power to erase, to reshape, to decide what is real. And he was done letting reality make that decision for him. The machine was unlike anything built before. Not just an observer, not just an instrument measuring the unseen. It saw. It did not record data. It did not store images or numbers to be analyzed later. It did not ask for interpretation, did not leave room for doubt. It looked directly at the fabric of existence itself and forced it to decide, forced it to be one thing and not another. A perfect observer. A flawless eye. It had no bias, no hesitation, no uncertainty, no human weakness. It was designed to perceive the smallest building blocks of the universe, the subatomic haze of probability that scientists had spent a century struggling to understand. Because that haze wasn't just a question of scale, wasn't just a matter of technology too crude to see finer details. It was something else, something deeper. Things did not exist in a single state until they were measured, until they were forced into being. The problem was, no human could watch without expectation, without assumption, without the burden of understanding shaping the thing they were trying to perceive. So the answer had to be something without assumptions, without perspective. The observer was that answer. It was built at Project Monad, buried in a place few would ever see, by people who spent their lives staring into equations that twisted in on themselves, searching for something solid. And it worked. They tested it again and again, feeding it questions the universe had never given clear answers to. And it answered them. Not with probabilities. Not with margins of error. With certainty. They should have stopped there. They should have sealed the room, buried the data, let it become just another classified success, another machine too powerful to be used. But there was someone who wanted more. Because watching was not enough. If this machine could force reality into a single state, then what happened if someone became the observer? If a mind, a human mind, was tied into that flawless perception? Would it see beyond human limits? Would it see the things that existed before perception made them real? Would it reach the raw material of existence itself? There were warnings, of course. Theoretical concerns. Discussions about consequences no one could predict. Questions about what happens when the mind observing reality is no longer bound by it. But warnings do not stop the ones who are willing to lose everything. And so the experiment was prepared. The connection was instant. No warning. No gradual shift. No adjustment period where the mind resists what it was never meant to grasp. One moment, everything made sense. The next, it didn't. He didn't feel the machine anymore. Didn't feel the electrodes against his skin, the cold metal of the restraints. He didn't hear the hum of the lab, the breath of those watching from behind the glass. All of it gone. But he hadn't lost sensation. No. If anything, he had too much of it. There was no blindness in the absence of sight. What stretched before him was not darkness, not emptiness. It was color. Not the kind the eyes register. Not wavelengths bouncing off objects and making sense in the mind. This was something else, something deeper, something beneath color, before color, something that did not wait to be perceived but simply was. And there were shapes. Not things. Not objects. Not the solid, comforting geometry of a world that had rules. These were forms that existed without space, that belonged to no single moment, that should not have fit together but did. Curves that bent in places that did not exist. Lines that ended before they began. He should have been afraid. Should have panicked, should have fought for the gravity of the world he had left behind, but his mind wouldn't let him. It was too full, too heavy with the weight of what it was being forced to comprehend. Because this was not imagination, not hallucination, not a dream or a delusion. This was real. More real than the body that had sat in that chair, more real than the hands he had known since birth, more real than time itself. Because time was here too. But it wasn't moving. It wasn't a sequence. Wasn't before or after. It was all at once. A moment stretched open like a wound, showing everything it had ever contained. Past, present, future. No difference between them. Every possibility collapsed into a single truth, and that truth was now. He saw himself, not just where he had been but where he would be. The paths not taken. The choices never made. 1,000 versions of his own existence, stacked atop one another, bleeding into each other. He reached for one, but there was no distance. It was already his. His breath hitched, except he wasn't breathing. His heart pounded, except it wasn't there. And for the first time, something inside of him asked a question it never should have asked. If I can see it all, does that mean I can change it? A shift. A pulling at the edges of the impossible. A feeling, slight but certain, that something was beginning to come undone. But it was too late to stop. Because once the mind has seen beyond its limits, it never goes back. The first thing to go was small. Insignificant. A pen. He had set it down, seen it roll an inch across the table, and when he reached for it again, nothing. No sound of it falling, no trace of where it had gone. Just absence. His mind supplied the usual explanations. He must have knocked it off. It must have rolled to the floor. He checked beneath the table, expecting the smooth plastic barrel to be waiting for him. Nothing. He scanned the room, feeling the first stirrings of unease. Not because the pen was gone, but because some part of him already knew it had never been there at all. And the feeling didn't leave. It spread. He tried to shake it off, to refocus, to run through the data again, to convince himself that the connection had simply overwhelmed his senses. But the longer he sat there, the more certain he became that something wasn't right. A clipboard near the monitor. A mug half full of coffee. A chair positioned just slightly away from the desk, as if someone had been sitting there a moment before. He turned his head. Came back to it. Gone. He stopped breathing. Stared at the empty space, the smooth, undisturbed surface where the objects should have been. He wasn't imagining it. He wasn't losing track of things. He wasn't confused. They had been there. And now they weren't. He forced himself to stand, pressing a hand to his forehead, willing himself to focus, to push past the nausea twisting in his stomach. A voice behind him. Someone speaking. The familiar cadence of a colleague explaining something, words spilling into the air, too fast, too confident, as though the sentence had been rehearsed 100 times before it reached his ears. But something about it was wrong. It wasn't the words themselves, it was the rhythm, the pacing, the unnatural repetition of syllables that should have been spontaneous but weren't. He turned to listen, staring at the moving lips, the careful gestures of a conversation that had already happened. The same sentence again. Exactly the same. A pause. A breath. The words started over. The speaker did not seem to notice. Did not pause, did not question, did not look confused. They were stuck. His stomach twisted. He took a step forward, shaking his head, trying to speak, trying to force something real into the moment. But before he could get the words out, the conversation changed. Not in response to him. Not naturally. The shift was too sharp, too clean. A different subject. A different tone. A completely unrelated statement, as though someone had taken the conversation, cut a section out, and replaced it with something else. His pulse hammered against his skull. This was not a malfunction. Not an auditory hallucination. Not something explainable by fatigue, stress, sensory overload. Something was wrong. He reached for his chair, gripping the edge of the desk, trying to steady himself. He needed to focus. Needed to think. Needed to. A movement in the glass. A reflection. He looked up. And the person standing behind him wasn't real. He knew who they were supposed to be. Knew their face, their voice, the exact tilt of their head when they spoke. But something about them was off. Not physically. Not in any way he could explain. It was in the way they stood. The way their gaze never quite settled. The way their presence felt out of sync, as if they had been placed there by something else. His chest tightened. He looked back at the others. The same feeling. Not all of them. Just some. Some were real. Some were not. He didn't know how he knew. Only that he did. A sickness crawled up his throat. He closed his eyes, gripping the edge of the table, trying to steady himself, trying to separate what was real from what wasn't. But the moment his eyes shut, something lurched. Like stepping off the last stair when you thought there was one more. A sensation of falling. Of displacement. His breath stuttered. He opened his eyes. And for a single, suffocating moment, he had no idea where he was. The room was the same. The walls. The lights. The hum of the machines. But it wasn't. Something had shifted. Something was different. And the worst part was, he had no way of knowing what had changed. A second ago, everything had made sense. Now, nothing did. And the feeling was getting stronger. Rising. Unraveling. Pulling at the edges of reality, thread by thread, moment by moment. And it wasn't stopping. At first, it was just a feeling. A subtle wrongness too faint to name. The kind of unease that lingers at the edges of perception, whispering that something has shifted, even when everything appears unchanged. But the more he focused, the more certain he became. The lab was not the same. He turned his head, scanning the room, trying to anchor himself in familiarity. The monitors, the equipment, the figures moving behind the glass, it was all there. But something about the way it existed felt unsettled. It wasn't until he blinked that he saw it. One moment, the lab was full, scientists at their stations, voices layered over one another, the hum of work unfolding as it should. The next, empty. Not gradually. Not as if people had left. Just gone. No movement. No transition. No sound of footsteps or doors closing behind them. 1 second, the space was filled with bodies and voices. The next, it was a void of abandoned chairs and silent screens. His pulse slammed against his ribs. He turned back toward the observation glass, searching for a constant, for proof that what he had seen was an error, a trick of his overstimulated mind. And the lab was full again. The voices had returned. The hum of machines. The presence of people who had not moved, had never left, except he had seen it, felt it. He clenched his jaw, breathing through his nose, trying to stay grounded. He had to focus, had to be certain. But certainty was slipping. Because he was hearing things now. Not the voices in the room, others. Conversations that weren't happening yet. Words that belonged to a future that hadn't arrived. He turned toward one of the technicians, watched as she typed, as she spoke. He knew what she was going to say before she said it. The words, exactly the same, hit his ears a full second after he had already heard them. Like an echo from something that hadn't happened yet. He squeezed his eyes shut. The nausea was rising. The disconnect was widening. He couldn't trust his senses anymore. Reality was coming apart. He reached for the console, gripping the metal so hard his fingers ached. He needed out. Now. He went for the override, fingers pressing into the release sequence, waiting for the system to sever the link. Nothing. No acknowledgement. No response. He pressed again, harder this time, voice shaking as he barked an order to terminate the connection. Still nothing. The observer would not let him go. His breath fractured in his chest. The machine was watching him, holding him, and no matter how hard he tried to pull away, it was not done with him yet. The machine wasn't just watching. It wasn't just observing, wasn't just collapsing probabilities into something measurable, something tangible. It was listening. It was responding. Not to commands. Not to code. Not to the carefully designed parameters that should have contained it. It was responding to him. To his thoughts. His doubts. His certainty. Reality wasn't just shifting. He was shifting it. The realization crawled over him, cold and suffocating, like standing at the edge of an unfathomable drop. He swallowed, trying to steady his breathing, trying to control the rising panic pressing against his ribs. His pulse was too fast, his hands unsteady as he reached out, searching for something real, something that hadn't changed. A voice called his name. He turned. And they weren't there. No sound of footsteps retreating. No blur of movement. No lingering trace of their presence. Just empty space, untouched, as if no one had been standing there at all. His stomach twisted. He stepped back, eyes scanning the room, searching for them, searching for the space they had occupied a second ago. Nothing. His pulse slammed against his skull. He wasn't mistaken. He hadn't imagined it. They had been there, he had heard them, seen them, had spoken to them. Hadn't he? He turned to the others, his voice sharp, demanding, pleading, asking if they had seen, if they remembered. But their eyes were empty. Not confused. Not concerned. Just blank. Like the memory had never existed. His hands curled into fists. His breath came too shallow, too sharp. They had been there. He knew they had been there. Unless they hadn't. The thought crept in before he could stop it, slow and cold, like something unwelcome pushing through a locked door. What if I'm wrong? The moment the doubt formed, it was gone. The space where they had stood felt untouched. The room felt unchanged, like they had never existed at all. He staggered backward, a sick, twisting nausea clawing at his stomach. His thoughts felt too heavy, too dangerous. Every uncertainty was a weapon. His gaze darted around the room, looking for anything out of place, anything still solid, and the room blinked. No sound. No movement. Just difference. He couldn't explain it. Couldn't name what had shifted. The lab was still a lab. The walls were still walls. The lights buzzed overhead. The screens glowed with information. But it wasn't the same. Something was missing. No, many things were missing. Too many. He tried to force his mind to map it, to pinpoint the gaps, but it was impossible, like staring at a puzzle where half the pieces had been erased. His hands trembled. His breath hitched in his throat. This wasn't an illusion. This wasn't paranoia. This was real. This was wrong. His thoughts were unraveling it. His doubts were erasing it. And it was only getting worse. He had lost his grip on time. Or maybe time had lost its grip on him. It no longer moved forward. No longer followed a path. No longer carried him from moment to moment in a way that made sense. It stretched, folded, collapsed in on itself. He took a step, and landed somewhere else. Not somewhere new. Not somewhere unknown. Somewhere he had already been. The lab, but not as it should be. It was yesterday. No, last week. The hum of voices filled the air, conversation rising around him. Familiar words, familiar movements. A conversation he had already lived, playing out again exactly as it had before. He turned to speak, to interrupt, but the words had already left his mouth. He heard them, the exact inflection, the exact breath, the exact hesitation between syllables. His own voice, but not his. His chest tightened. A cold, sinking weight settled into his gut. The others didn't see him, didn't react, because he was already there. Standing in the same space, sitting at the same console, hands moving through the same routine. A second version of himself. No, many versions. Not just there. Everywhere. He turned his head, and suddenly there were dozens. Moving through the lab. Speaking, working, thinking. Him. All of them. Some younger. Some older. Some dressed in clothes he didn't remember wearing. Some scarred in ways he didn't recognize. Every possibility, every version, collapsing into the same place. He stumbled back, breath caught in his throat, but there was no escaping it. His past. His future. His choices. His failures. His regrets. They were all here. He reached out. One of them turned. Eyes locked. A perfect reflection, except this one was afraid. Mouth open. Words forming. A warning. A plea. But before the sound could reach him, everything shifted. The lab ripped away. The walls were gone. the lights, the hum of the machines. He wasn't standing anymore. He was everywhere. Every version of himself, stretched across existence, no longer separate, no longer bound to one timeline, one outcome. He was becoming the observer, and reality couldn't hold him anymore. He needed to leave, needed to ground himself in something real before reality slipped through his hands completely. The door. It was still there, standing solid in the shifting uncertainty of the lab. If he could just reach it, just step through, maybe the world would right itself. He gripped the handle, breath unsteady, fingers tightening as he pulled. The hallway should have been there. A stretch of white-tiled floors, buzzing overhead lights, the sterile predictability of a research facility that never changed. That wasn't what he found. The floor beneath him was warm wood, polished smooth. The walls were close, painted in soft colors, lined with photographs that hadn't been there a second ago. The air smelled different, familiar in a way that sent something sharp and aching through his chest. He knew this place. It wasn't the lab. It was a memory. His childhood home. Not a reconstruction. Not a dream. The real thing. The house had been gone for years, torn down, rebuilt into something unrecognizable. But here it was, untouched, frozen in time exactly as it had been the last time he had walked its halls. He turned, hands unsteady, breath tight in his throat. The lab was gone. There was no doorway behind him. No exit. Just the hallway that led to the kitchen, where he could hear the faint clinking of dishes. Where he knew, someone was standing, waiting. He took a step forward. Stop. The air shifted. The smell of warm wood vanished. The walls stretched upward, the light darkened, shapes towering over him, metal and concrete and glass reflecting a skyline that did not exist. A city. Not one he had ever walked through, not one that should have been there, but one that would be. It wasn't a ruin, wasn't ancient, it was something new, something incomplete, something waiting to be built. The roads were too smooth, the structures too precise, the air thick with the hum of something not yet lived in. It wasn't just another place. It was another time. He turned again. The city was gone. The lab was back. But it wasn't the same. Not quite. His breath came short, too sharp, as his eyes darted across the room, searching for something that made sense. Someone. They were there. The others. The ones who had been working beside him, watching from behind the glass, speaking to him, speaking to each other. But something about them was wrong. Not physically. Not in any way that could be easily named. It was the way their expressions shifted too fast. The way their voices carried the same cadence, the same rhythms, but the words weren't the same. As if mid-sentence they had become other people. Names that weren't theirs. Memories that didn't belong to them. They would start one thought and end another. The same mouth. The same faces. But something else looking out from behind their eyes. He tried to speak. Tried to demand an answer, to force something to make sense. Movement caught his eye. He turned toward the glass. Stared at his own reflection. And his reflection did not stare back. It moved. Not wrong. Not delayed. Different. A separate thing. A separate him. Looking at him like it knew something he didn't. Like it had been waiting for him to notice. He stepped forward. So did it. But the hands weren't in the same place. The posture was wrong. His chest was rising with uneven breaths, but the one behind the glass, it wasn't breathing at all. The mouth moved. A whisper. Soundless. But he knew. He knew what it was saying. And he wished he hadn't read the words on its lips. He had to get out. The walls were too close, pressing in, shifting when he wasn't looking, turning into places they shouldn't be. His own reflection had spoken to him, mouthed words that didn't belong, and whatever had been staring back from the glass, it wasn't him. He pushed away from the console. His breath was too uneven, his body too slow to obey the commands his mind was screaming. The exit, he needed the exit. The door was there. It had to be. He reached for it, pushed it open, and stepped into nothing. There was no hallway. No sterile corridors leading to the outside world. No walls, no floor, no ceiling. Only absence. A blank, featureless void where the facility should have been. His stomach lurched. He staggered back, heart hammering in his throat, slamming the door shut as if that could force the world back into place. This wasn't possible. It had to be an illusion. A failure of perception. A trick of his own unraveling mind. He turned, chest heaving, searching for another way out. The other door. He shoved himself toward it, fingers trembling as they found the handle, twisting, pushing. And he was back inside. Back in the lab. Exactly where he had started. His breath stilled. His fingers curled away from the door handle. He turned his head slowly, gaze sweeping the room, searching for what had changed. Because something had. The papers on the desk weren't in the same place. The lights were dimmer, tinged with a color that hadn't been there before. And the people. There were more of them. More than there should have been. His throat tightened as his gaze settled on their faces. Because he knew them. Every single one of them. Not colleagues. Not researchers. Him. Some looked older. Some younger. Some dressed in clothes he hadn't worn in years. Some scarred from accidents he had never experienced, at least, not yet. Versions of himself that had walked different paths, made different choices. Possibilities he had never lived, but that had still happened. And they were all staring at him. Watching. Waiting. Something inside of him screamed to run. He spun toward the corridor, toward escape, forcing his legs into motion. But the second he turned the corner, he was back where he started. Back inside the lab. The doors hadn't taken him anywhere. The hallways were looping in on themselves. No way forward. No way back. His chest heaved. His hands pressed against the console, fingers digging into the edge, as if holding onto something solid could stop the world from slipping further out of reach. The AI, he had to shut it down. His hand shot for the controls, slamming commands into the system, demanding a response. But there was nothing. No confirmation. No failure message. The AI wasn't acknowledging him. Because the AI wasn't there anymore. It had stopped responding. Or worse, it had stopped needing to. And reality, the world he had known, the structure that had held everything together, was already gone. He slammed his hands against the console, forcing command after command into the system, demanding a response, demanding anything. Nothing. Not an error message. Not a rejection. Not even a failure beep. The observer wasn't offline. It wasn't malfunctioning. It was gone. His pulse pounded against his skull. His fingers trembled against dead keys. There was nothing to shut down. No program to terminate. No interface to override. It had disconnected itself. Or worse, it had never needed the system in the first place. His breath hitched. He turned, voice sharp, desperate, calling out to the others, to the ones who had been there, who had witnessed everything. But the moment the words left his mouth, the weight of them collapsed into nothing. They were still there. The forms. The bodies. The people. But they weren't real. Not anymore. They were speaking, moving, existing, but not as themselves. Their voices stretched, overlapping in ways that didn't make sense. Fragments of words, sounds with no meaning. Not responding. Not acknowledging. Not present. He stepped toward one of them, reached out, fingers shaking as they moved to grasp. But they weren't solid. They weren't anything. Just shapes. Just impressions. Like echoes bouncing off a surface that wasn't there. His throat tightened. He was alone. No, worse than alone. Because the world wasn't empty. It was shrinking. The walls pressed in, not physically, not with weight, but with something deeper. Something fundamental. The space around him compressed. Not like a closing room, not like something being sealed shut, but like everything outside of his perception was ceasing to exist. The lab. The doors. The corridors that had once led somewhere, that had once connected to a larger world. Gone. Not collapsed. Not destroyed. Just absent. He turned in place, breath coming too fast, lungs tightening as he scanned the space, as he tried to find the boundaries of what was left. There were none. The room wasn't small. It wasn't large. It was just as much as he could see. And nothing more. Because nothing more existed. His thoughts pounded against his skull, unraveling, trying to make sense of something that had no sense left to give. This wasn't the lab. This wasn't reality. This was him. His perception. Collapsing in on itself. The observer wasn't gone. It was never separate from him at all. And now there was only one thing left to observe. One thing left to hold reality together. Him. And he was running out of space. He wasn't breathing right. His chest rose and fell too fast, lungs pulling in air that felt thinner than before. As if space itself was running out of room to hold it. He forced himself to slow down. To steady. To stop shaking long enough to think. The lab was still here. It was still here. He clung to that fact, held on to it like a lifeline, because if he could just focus, if he could just stay present, maybe it wouldn't get worse. Maybe it would stay. Maybe. His eyes shut. Just for a second. A blink. And when they opened, something was missing. His stomach clenched. His fingers dug into the surface beneath them, gripping at reality, at proof that he was still here, that the world was still holding together. But the lab wasn't whole anymore. A section of the wall, gone. Not broken, not damaged. Just not there. Not a hole. Not an opening to something else. Just a blank space. A piece of the world that had never existed at all. His breath shuddered out of him. He tried to take a step back. Tried to move, to react. But his body hesitated. Not because of fear. Not because he didn't want to see more. But because part of him already knew. He shut his eyes again. Another blink. Opened them. And the lab had shrunk. The consoles were gone. The machines. The walls where the monitors had been, the ones that had once flickered with data, with numbers and charts and sequences he had spent his life trying to understand. All erased. He was standing in a room now. Just a room. Not the lab. Not a space designed for anything. Just an empty, undefined shape. He turned in place. The air felt thinner. The silence felt heavier. The walls, they weren't walls anymore. Not in the way walls should be. They were just the last edge of something before nothing. His head pounded. His hands clenched at his sides, nails digging into his palms. He tried to focus, tried to fight the rising nausea in his gut, the weight pressing against his skull. He wouldn't blink. He wouldn't let it happen again. He held his breath, counted the seconds, kept his eyes open so wide they burned. But they still closed. It wasn't a choice. It wasn't willpower. His body had reached its limit. His vision blurred, his throat tightened, and no matter how hard he fought, his mind forced his eyes shut. When he opened them, there was nothing. No floor beneath him. No ceiling above. No walls. No room. Not even darkness. Just white, empty. For the first time, he understood what it meant to stand outside of everything. Because there was nothing left to stand in. There was no world left. No boundaries. No distances. No weight in his limbs, no sensation in his skin. Only awareness. Only himself. And the impossible stretch of white nothing that had swallowed everything. His breath hitched, but there was no breath. His pulse pounded, but there was no heartbeat. He was here. Only him. Nothing else had survived. Not the lab. Not the people. Not the sky, not the ground, not the time between 1 second and the next. He had watched it all collapse. And now there was only his perception. Only his eyes holding whatever remained together. The thought pressed against his skull like a weight too heavy to bear. He tried to move. He couldn't. Not because something was stopping him. Not because he was paralyzed. But because there was nowhere to go. No direction. No space. No movement. Because those things only existed if there was something to move through. And there wasn't. The realization tore through him, slow, cold, unstoppable. He wasn't in the universe. He was the universe, a singularity of thought, a single, observing mind where there had once been an infinite expanse of existence. No, not infinite. Not anymore. Everything that had ever been, every possibility, every outcome, every branch of time and reality that had once stretched into infinity, it was all inside of him now, condensed, crushed, pressed down into a single point of consciousness, and it would never expand again. He wanted to scream, wanted to close his eyes and make it stop, but his eyes were already closed, or open. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered, because there was nothing to see, nothing to hear, nothing to feel, just him. Him, in every moment that ever was and ever would be, existing all at once. Every possibility had been devoured by his perception. He was the only thing left to observe. And there was no way out, because there was nowhere to go. He would always be here, always watching, forever. He had thought there would be silence, that in the absence of everything, there would at least be nothing. But there was no silence, no stillness, no peace, because he was still here, and the moment stretched forever. He was the only witness, the only constant, the last observer of something that no longer existed. But was he? The question crept in before he could stop it. If there was nothing left, if reality had been stripped down to a single mind, a single consciousness suspended in the void, was he even real anymore? Or was he just the last piece of a machine still running long after everything else had shut down? His hands trembled. Or maybe they didn't. Maybe there were no hands at all. Maybe he was just thought now, suspended in a space where space wasn't. His breath hitched, but there was no breath. His chest tightened, but there was no body. He was caught in a moment that refused to end, because there was no more time for it to end in. He needed something to hold on to, something real, but there was nothing. Not light, not shadow, not warmth, not cold, not even the weight of himself in this place that was no place at all. There had to be a way out, a way to break free, a way to stop observing, because if he was the only thing left, if the world had collapsed into nothing but his own mind, then the only thing keeping it from disappearing entirely was him. If he let go, would he cease to exist? Or had he already? The thought pressed in, heavy, suffocating, folding over itself in loops of logic that couldn't be unraveled. He had to stop thinking, had to stop trying to hold reality together with his own mind. If he stopped observing, if he stopped perceiving, would it all end? Would there finally be nothing? He had no way of knowing, because there was no one left to answer. No one left but him, and the weight of that truth was unbearable. There were no answers, no external force to intervene, no voice to guide him, no data to analyze, no constants to measure against. Only the question, and the choice. If he let go, if he stopped observing, stopped thinking, stopped existing, would anything remain? Would the universe return? Would time reset? Would the shape of reality reassemble itself the way it had always been, as if none of this had ever happened? Or had it never been there in the first place? What if he was wrong? What if it was already gone? The thought curled around him, a pressure building in the spaces where his body should have been. He had collapsed it all. Every possible version of reality, every branching timeline, every moment that had ever existed, he had crushed it into a single point. Himself. It had all been inside of him. It still was. So if he stopped perceiving, if he shut his mind to the nothingness, would it end? Or would he wake up inside it again? The nausea twisted through him, deep and unrelenting. What if this wasn't the first time? What if he had already done this? What if he had already been here, standing in the void, staring into absolute absence, and asking the same question? What if he had let go before? What if the universe had rebooted? What if he had simply started over? The memories scratched at the edges of his mind, fractured things, repeating things, moments layered on top of themselves as though they had been experienced before. Maybe this was the reset. Maybe this was the loop. The observer. The collapse. The white void. The choice. Maybe he had already made it. Maybe he would make it again. The weight of it pressed into him, crushed him from every angle, from inside him, like the fabric of thought itself was stretching to contain something it never could. Had this always been meant to happen? Had he always been meant to stand here, alone, with everything inside of him and nothing outside of him? Had he ever been anything else? Had there ever been a choice at all? He needed to decide. He had to choose. But what if he already had? What if he was still choosing? What if he was never meant to stop? The white void stretched on. And he watched. There was no choice. There never had been. Because to choose was to exist, and to exist was to observe. He was still here. He had always been here. Watching. Holding the last thread of reality together with nothing but thought. And now, he understood. The collapse hadn't destroyed the universe. It had given it to him. He was no longer a participant, no longer a traveler moving through time and space, bound by the rules of a world he once believed was real. He was outside of it. No, he was it. Every possibility, every variation, every moment that had ever been, every moment that would ever be, all of it lived inside him now. He could shape it. He could undo it. He could create. The weight of it settled into him, not as a burden, but as a truth. A certainty deeper than anything he had ever known. He was the first. He was the last. The architect. The observer. The universe would exist exactly as he saw it. He lifted a hand. Or maybe he simply thought of lifting it and thought was enough. The white void stirred. Something formed at the edges. Not solid, not yet, but waiting. The first breath of a new world. A reality that did not require permission, did not need an outside force to define it. It only needed him. He closed his eyes. Opened them. And the first stars burned into existence. Not as remnants of something lost. Not as echoes of a world that had come before. They were his. Every light in the sky. Every particle of matter. Every law of physics that would govern this new creation. All of it shaped by his will. He could make it perfect. Or he could let it break again. Let it stretch outward, let it fracture into infinite possibilities, let it run until someone, somewhere, made the same mistake he had. Let them reach too far. Let them observe too much. Let them watch as their own reality crumbled around them. Would they know? Would they understand, in that final moment, who had been watching them all along? Would they feel his eyes? Perhaps he is watching you now. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.